Well, hello there, students. This is Mr. Little, and today we are going to take a look at this lecture slide on the road to World War II. So by the end of this here presentation, you should be able to answer the three following essential questions. Number one is, why was the World War I peace settlement unable to prevent World War II? How did the quest for resources and autarky contribute to the outbreak of World War II? And how did the international political situation in the 1930s lay the groundwork for World War II? With that said, let's go ahead and get into it. In general, this presentation is not going to talk about a lot of the greater ideological underpinnings or even the Great Depression that much. I've covered most of that in previous lectures that I'll go ahead and link in the description. I'll touch on these things very briefly. And like World War I, the causes of World War II can be summarized, and they even have a nice little acronym I've put together. It's called Grau, which is German for gray, like the background of this presentation. And it stands for the Great Depression, Resources and Ideologies, Appeasement, and the Unsustainable Peace Settlement. So we're going to talk a lot more about the R, A, and the U than the G, since we've already done the Great Depression in a separate video. So let's talk a little bit about the unsustainable peace settlements in Europe specifically. Again, other lecture I'll link below if you want more information. But basically, the end of World War I saw the breakup of a lot of the large empires we've talked about for a long time in this course, right? All of this was done in the name of self-determination. That said, a lot of those nations, when they broke up, they created little tiny nations that within those nations, there were groups that didn't have quote unquote self-determination. They might have been nations within nations. So for example, in Poland, which gained independence through self-determination, and it was part of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, there were then a lot of Germans living in Poland who were suddenly saying, wait a minute, we don't have self-determination because we just got kicked, we just got removed from the German state. And so this led to instability and sometimes even violence. Like in the case of the western part of Poland, there was a group of events known as the Silesian uprisings, and were just caused disruption, and this was a series of violent uprisings. There's also something known as territorial revanchism. So this was the most obvious example of this is Germany wanting its territory back after the war. However, it also includes things like Italy, as you can see in this map here, which was promised a bunch of territory along the Adriatic, the parts in yellow, which it did not get, and it was very irritated about that. And so sometimes students ask, well, how did Italy go from fighting with Britain and France to fighting against Britain and France? Well, that's part of the reason. That's part of it. In addition, there were attempts to limit the militarism of Europe, like in general, like just tone down the size of armies, tone down the weapons, tone down the warfare. And this was put into the Treaty of Versailles. Germany wasn't supposed to have any tanks. Germany wasn't supposed to have any airplanes. Germany was only supposed to have 100,000 men. But that didn't really work because Germany just went to the Soviet Union, signed the Treaty of Rapallo, and then they built tanks in the Soviet Union, brought them back to Germany, and proceeded to improve them, test them, make them work. And of course, the Great Depression, which again, I've talked a lot about in other lectures, but I just want to reiterate that the inability of the existing democratic states or semi-democratic states to actually solve the problems of the Depression kind of opened the door for very many anti-democratic ideas. And the two of which we know of are Nazi Germany with their remilitarization and their aggressive welfare spending, as well as the Soviet Union with their 5-year plan, which happened to begin right as the Great Depression was beginning and made the Soviet Union look really, really good. In years past on the AP exam, there was a multiple choice question that discussed how these two sorts of governments were really popular, in part because the democracy simply failed to really solve the Depression. Even the United States with its social democracy couldn't really end the Depression. It would take World War II to do that. Beyond Europe, though, there was a lot of instability, anger, discontent, just a general unhappiness with the way things had gone. In particular, the case of Japan with the rise of its militarism. Now, you might remember from World War I, the British and the Americans had interfered with their efforts to establish sort of a protectorate in China by stopping the 21 demands. And then after the war, while the peace treaty was being drawn up, Japan had asked that there be a racial equality clause put into the League of Nations covenant, to which America, Australia, and South Africa all said no. And if you're wondering why they did that, that's because they all had racially charged immigration policies that could have potentially been undermined by any sort of racial equality clause in the League covenant. And so the inability of the Japanese to get sort of an acknowledgement of their contributions to the war effort and acknowledgement of them as a great power, at least the way they saw it, sort of signaled to them that they couldn't really be friends with the West. They had to sort of strike it out on their own. We're going to talk a little bit more about what that means. They also attempted rather unsuccessfully to establish sort of an empire in Siberia. So they would, the idea had been that they would establish sort of an Eastern empire along the coast of Russia in Siberia. So they were there for about 4 years during the Russian Civil War, but it didn't really establish any long-term settlements. And beyond that, there were just a number of revolts, unhappiness, particularly in the Middle East, and particularly in British Palestine. There was a lot of discontent and anger at the situation. Zionist militias, Arab militias, there was just a lot of violence that the British were having an increasingly difficult time dealing with. And so up here you can see one of the Arab militias from this time. This is the future Arab flag. Notice, by the way, it has a crescent and a cross, symbolizing the two religions of the Arab people. There was the Soviet Union, of course, going out there and spreading its communism like you do. The Comintern was like an international congress of communists from around the world. And what they did is they encouraged anti-colonial activity. In particular, they founded the University of the Toilers of the East in Moscow. Activists could go learn about the Soviet Union, learn about ways to advocate for home rule and self-determination, then go back to their colonies, maybe found a communist party, or start continuing to advocate for self-determination. For example, M.N. Roy, who founded the Mexican Communist Party and was active in Bengal and India for many years, was a graduate of the University of the Toilers of the East. I believe it's been renamed. I think it's called, I don't even know what it's called. It was renamed like 4 times, but it's part of Moscow University today. And of course, there's Pan-Africanism. Now, you might remember the very first Pan-African Congress was right at the end of World War I. The very last one will be right at the end of World War II. And there were 3 held in between the world wars. And the idea was that they were simply demanding home rule for Africa, like consistently advocating for, pushing for, like, hey, look, people in Africa need home rule, need the opportunity to follow their own destiny, right? They're not saying independence, not yet, but they're saying we should have more of a say. We should have less economic exploitation, right? These private European companies shouldn't be allowed to just run rampant and exploit the resources of Africa, right? And that kind of ties in with what you also saw across West Africa, which was a lot of strikes and protests. In particular, in, I believe, 1931, there was a cacao growers who didn't want to pay the artificially low prices their British administrators had set for them. And so they just burned all their cacao plants. They're just like, no, we're not going to do this. And so it was sort of a strike. And what was interesting about that strike is that it got a lot of international support. African student groups in London, African student groups in the Caribbean, the United States supported the strike with money and publicity. So around the world, people were just generally not happy with the peace settlements. We usually talk about Germany and Japan, but it's worth noting that globally, even if there hadn't been any issues with Germany and Japan, this peace settlement was not going to be able to last super long. It was not sustainable. Let's talk about resources and ideologies. Like World War I, World War II is in part a competition over resources, although a little bit more so than World War I. And in particular, the 2 primary antagonists of the war, that would be Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, were on a quest for autarky, that is self-sufficiency. They didn't want to have to trade with other nations. We're going to explain why. So for Germany in particular, this concern of theirs was remembering the blockade from World War I. That blockade had crippled the ability of the German war machine after 4 years to continue fighting because it prevented food from getting into Germany. And after 4 years, the people at home were starving and it was unsustainable. Now, the other side of this was that Adolf Hitler had said the German people needed Lebensraum. And again, I've already kind of explained what Lebensraum is, but basically it was the idea that they needed to conquer territory, in particular the Soviet Union, so that they could have the necessary space, living space to exist. The idea was that Germany itself was just too small for the German people to survive. It had to take space from Poland, space from the Soviet Union, or in the case of this picture right here on the left, they wanted its colonies back in Africa they had lost during World War I. Now, I should also point out that today, the density of people in Germany, so Germany today is smaller than it was in 1940, and it has about 30 million more people than it did in 1940. So technically, the Germans are existing in a space that's too small for them to survive, according to Adolf Hitler's work. And yet, I don't think Germany is like gearing up to go conquer any living space anytime soon. Japan was not quite the same situation, but it was somewhat similar. So what Japan, even though it had been an industrialized nation since the Meiji reforms, still imported about 80% of its oil from the United States and the Netherlands. Japan did have some coal, but it didn't have much in the way of oil or any of those second industrial revolution required materials. And so it was very concerned about its dependence on the United States and the Dutch East Indies for its oil. And this particularly became concerning when, during the 1930s, it began to get aggressive in China, waging an imperialist war. The United States and the Netherlands embargoed both steel and oil to Japan. And this was decried in the Japanese press. It was called the ABCD line, which stood for American, British, Chinese, and Dutch line. The idea that they were trying to encircle Japan, prevent it from being able to exist on its own or live on its own. And to sort of counter this, Japanese leaders had for a long time had ideas like this, but it was sort of formalized the vision of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. The idea being that Japan was going to reshape how Asia traded, and they were going to remove the imperialist powers, and they were going to recenter trade around Tokyo. So Tokyo would be the new center of Asia. The Dutch would be forced to leave, the British would be forced to leave, the French would be kicked out, the Americans would be kicked out, and Tokyo would reshape the trade in Asia. There's actually some really interesting academic stuff about how they tried to do this with tea, and they tried to use tea as sort of like an example of how the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere could work by encouraging farmers in the parts of China they occupied to grow tea, and then they sort of ship that tea to Tokyo, and then they use that tea to sell to other parts of the world in the years before World War II. So there's this vision, and you can kind of see a map of it right here, this greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. So on the other side of this, instead of talking about resources, the other side of the ideological war, more than World War I, World War II is definitely a war of ideologies. Now, an ideology is sort of a layman's definition. A sort of layman's definition of an ideology is something that you take for granted. It's a system of ideas, thoughts, beliefs that forms an entire worldview to the point where you don't even question it. Fascism is an ideology, communism is an ideology, but democracy is also kind of ideology, right? It forms a whole worldview. It's a way you think the world should be organized and looked at. So in terms of ideologies, they played a key role in actually sparking the conflict, right? So fascism as an ideology actually argued that war was a necessity. For fascists, there could not be peace. Peace was death. Pacifism was just the slow, gradual death of the nation or the people or whatever you were talking about. So fascism itself is very war hungry. It idolizes military strength. And I've talked a lot about this already in a previous lecture, but I really wanted to sort of stress that all the major powers had some sort of vision. The fascist powers had some sort of vision for what they wanted their nation to look like. Lebensraum for the German people, but not just living space economically, living space culturally, as in the Germans must not only take territory in Eastern Europe, they must exterminate the Slavic peoples living there, right? This is a sort of a racial war. And the Italian fascists also had something like this. Mussolini liked to talk about a new Roman Empire as the special destiny of the Italian people. As you can see down here, he liked to portray himself next to Caesar and other great Roman historical figures, right? It's also worth noting both that fascism hated communism like without parallel. And so for Italy and Germany, the Soviet Union was like an existential threat that was going to have to be dealt with eventually. So there was sort of an understanding that eventually the Soviet Union was going to have to be dealt with. And we'll talk more about that in a second. For Imperial Japan, it was a little bit different. Ever since Japan had industrialized and beaten China and Russia in the various wars after its industrialization and during its industrialization, there had been this idea of sort of Japan as the supreme Asian race, right? And because Japan was the supreme Asian race, they were going to go ahead and liberate the rest of Asia. This is going to be called Pan-Asianism, or as Japan would say, Asia for the Asians, except of course it'll be under Japanese hegemony, and that's kind of the idea. And they play this up a lot. Like this is a pamphlet from World War II in which they talk about how Japan is leading the peoples of northern China, Manchukuo, the Philippines. They're getting along with everybody. They're helping to liberate the peoples of Asia. To a lesser extent, the Soviet Union was also in on the ideological game. The Soviet Union saw itself in the years leading up to World War II as surrounded by enemies. You have the capitalists in the United States and Western Europe. You have the fascists right on their doorstep in the form of Germany. So the Soviet Union saw itself as encircled by threats and enemies and saw it as its goal to break this encirclement and maybe lead a global communist revolution. Although the global communist revolution wasn't a super important rallying cry during World War II. That was just sort of in some pre-war propaganda. And it came up occasionally, but it wasn't the main goal. We're going to talk about that in the next lecture. So if you want to pause the video, that's fine. This is sort of a nice little T chart, or what do you call this? A chi-square chart, where you can kind of cross the ideological and economic motives for both of the main antagonists of World War II. So sort of resources and ideology and how they both played a role. So let's talk a little bit about the weak international situation. So when we talk about why World War II happened, people like to point at the League of Nations. Pointing out the League of Nations had failed. If you're defining failure as preventing World War II, then yes, absolutely, the League of Nations failed. It was not able to prevent World War II. And in part, it was not able to make the concept of collective security a reality. Collective security is what the League relied upon, right? The idea that everybody will act in the interest of keeping global peace. Now, that sounded great in theory, but it is one of the reasons the United States did not join. Many Americans didn't like the idea of possibly sending their boys over to die somewhere for a war they didn't want to fight in. And this was the same thing with the great powers, Britain and France. So, for example, when Italy began to be aggressive against Ethiopia and attacking Ethiopia, Britain and France were not willing to stop selling weapons to Italy. They weren't willing to stop selling oil to Italy, right? And so this pretty much made the League pointless, right? If the great powers aren't actually willing to take action, then nothing's going to work. It's also worth noting the League didn't even have the majority of world states. Notably, the United States wasn't there, but also a lot of Latin American states who had joined the League probably just left the League after like 5 years because they just didn't see it as a valid forum to address their issues. They didn't see it as helping maintain international peace. And, this lack of collective security and the fact that only like half the world was really in on it meant that, and especially to people who were under an imperial domination, they just saw it as like a Britain and France league, or a league of imperialism, not a league of nations, a league of imperial nations. In fact, the League Against Imperialism is one of the great interwar conventions that sort of criticize the League of Nations as being nothing more than a continuation of imperialism. Today, and we're going to talk about it in about 2 lectures from now, is that the United Nations has tried to sort of fix this issue with the peacekeeper thing, but we'll talk about that. There were small successes. Of course, we don't want to be too hard on the League. So, for example, it did a great job in relocating and getting refugees home after World War I. In particular, it came up with a system called the Nansen Passport, which was an international passport refugees could use that sort of documented them as refugees, but allowed them to move as they needed to be. The UN sort of has something like this today to try to help displaced people find a permanent home or eventually get back to their home. The League also prevented a couple of border wars in South America, and it also pressured many of the nations of the Middle East to formally end any systems of slavery that still existed. Obviously, some nations didn't really comply, like Saudi Arabia. There was still slavery practice there up until the 1960s. But there were some small successes in the League that maybe we shouldn't see it as a complete failure. And perhaps even if the League didn't prevent World War II, we also ought to think about the League as one of the first time when, at least in theory, small nations and big nations alike could stand on the same stage and have an equal voice. In theory, obviously, maybe that didn't happen in practice, but it put the idea out there, and that's something worth noting. So, failure of collective security and failure of an enforcement mechanism. All right, let's talk really quick about appeasement. Now, appeasement is a word that you really need to know going into World War II. Now, the way to think about appeasement is that it's sort of a policy of trying to prevent an aggressive power or maybe a bully from causing you trouble or causing you issues by giving them what they want to avoid a conflict. A nice analogy that I remember from high school, which is not a perfect analogy, but I think if it helps sort of illustrate it, is if you give a mouse a cookie. If you ever read the book, as I have in the corner here, To Give a Mouse a Cookie, then you know that if you give a mouse a cookie, he's going to want some milk. And if he wants some milk, he's going to need a napkin. And he's going to need a napkin. And the book goes on and on like that. It's a very funny book. You can read it if you have like 5 minutes, but it's kind of like that. The idea is if you just give Hitler and the Nazis what they want, maybe they'll not go to war with you. But the problem is that just keeps going. It keeps piling up and piling up, right? Well, we'll give them the Rhineland. Then we'll give them Austria. Then we'll give them the Sudetenland. Then we'll give them the rest of Czechoslovakia, right? Where does it end? Where does it stop, right? And so in retrospect, you can kind of see here that Germany got really big, got a lot of territory out of appeasement. And in retrospect, and I'll give you some dates in a second, but in retrospect, why did that seem like a good idea? Why did they do that anyway? But clearly, it just made the Nazi Germany stronger in the years before World War II. Wouldn't it have been better to not do that? Well, I mean, the League of Nations wasn't going to back anybody up. The League could only condemn things, right? And both Britain and France were practicing a bit of what we might call realpolitik, the idea that they literally couldn't do anything to stop Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany was just too powerful in this part of Europe, right? Austria wasn't going to be able to resist a German invasion. The Czechoslovakia might have been able to resist a German invasion, but not for very long. And so while France was itself in political turmoil pretty much every single year up until the years just before World War II, and was not able to really do much, even though it was not very happy that Germany was taking territory that made it stronger, France was not really able to do much. And Great Britain did not have the same military might it had had during World War I. In particular, the British military budget had been declining precipitously in the years after World War I. And so the British military was in no position to potentially go to war with Germany in 1935, 36, 37, 38, and barely even 1939. So in a certain sense, it was a bit of a reality check. Like they weren't actually going to be able to stop Germany from doing these things. The best they could do is hopefully get some promises or guarantees that maybe they won't do it again. But there was also, and this really, really ought to be stressed, there was sort of a sense that Eastern Europe was not super important to the Western powers. I know it sounds kind of odd to say, but, Poland only got a guarantee of its independence right after Germany took Czechoslovakia, right? The French and the British were not terribly concerned with Eastern Europe. France was kind of, but only in the sense that it could be a bulwark to Germany, not really in the sense that they actually cared about what happened in Eastern Europe. And even more sort of cynically, there was this idea that maybe we actually ought to strengthen Mr. Hitler. Maybe we need him to be strong against the Soviet communist threat, who are the real dangers just east of their border. So maybe we actually need to kind of, let Hitler take some territory. And look, as sort of another rationale went, I mean, some of that territory was quote unquote German anyway, right? I mean, the Rhineland was part of Germany, right? It had been demilitarized after World War I. We'll just give it back. That's fine. I mean, look, Austria speaks German. I mean, they're basically the same country, right? We could let them have it. It's not that big of a deal. Whatever attitude, at least in the beginning, right? To the first couple of annexations, it was like, well, I mean, come on, they're Germans anyway. So the question of why appeasement has a lot of answers, but in general, it's important to keep in mind that there was no international body to prevent appeasement, no League of Nations. Britain and France were not able to effectively counter any of these moves, either politically or militarily. And there was also a sense that, maybe communism was a bigger threat, the Soviet Union was the bigger threat, and that some of that territory was, German anyways. And why not let Mr. Hitler have that territory back? This was satirized in this lovely Soviet cartoon in this anti-Western propaganda from the Soviet Union, in which it shows, Britain and France serving up the Nazi wolf Czechoslovakia on a platter right here. And if you're curious about Germany's annexations, you can see a map of Germany's expansion right here. All right, if you'd like to pause the video real quick and just kind of screenshot or take a look at this timeline, I'm going to talk about a few things on here, but not everything on here. All right, so in general, though, this is sort of the appeasement timeline, if you will, right? So the big appeasement events that you'll need to know are the Japanese invaded Manchuria, that's northern China, setting up their puppet state of Manchukuo. In 1934 and 35, Italy invaded and occupied Ethiopia. Again, the League didn't do anything. In 1936, Germany remilitarizes the Rhineland. In 1938, it annexes Austria. And then in 1939, it annexes first the border region around Czechoslovakia and then all of Czechoslovakia. Those are the big ones. There's a couple of smaller ones in between there that you don't really need to worry that much about, but I just put on here to kind of give a kind of complete picture. It's worth noting that people did appeal to the League. So Haile Selassie, the emperor of Ethiopia, went to the League of Nations most famously and said, hey, Italy's invading my country. Are you going to do something about this? I'm an independent nation. Are you going to prevent me from being, prevent my nation from being occupied by an aggressive power? And the League was sort of like, no, we'll let you, how about we partition your country? The League did propose, Britain and France did propose that Ethiopia just give Italy the territory it was asking for, to which Haile Selassie was like, this is ridiculous. Right before World War II, it's worth noting that Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed what is called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. It was a secret pact that the Nazis and the Soviets agreed to divide up Eastern Europe, and you can see that right here. This is the division that they're going to lay out. And this is a satirical cartoon about how because these ideologies are fundamentally opposed, that this marriage is not going to last too long, but it is going to have a devastating effect on World War I, as we're going to see later. But the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact allowed a lot of this aggression in Eastern Europe, especially after Germany annexed Czechoslovakia and then right before World War II. Now, of course, we can't talk about World War II without talking about the test run, the beta trials of World War II, which were the Spanish Civil War. Now, Spain had become a republic in 1931 when the last king was politely asked to leave. And this was not a stable country, to put it mildly. There were ongoing tensions and questions and issues that this new republic was just not really able to solve. Constant street fighting and infighting between the major factions in the republic. There was a question of what languages should be allowed to be used. This is still kind of an issue today in Spain, although they've tried to solve it by just letting people speak their regional languages. But at the time, allowing Catalonia to speak Catalan and the Basque region to speak Basque struck some Spanish conservatives as just absolutely treasonous. Ever since Spain had become a united monarchy under Ferdinand and Isabella, Spanish had been the language of ruling and the language of much administration. And so all this kind of ongoing tension. And there was also a great question about church authority and church land. Spanish Republicans were very anti-clerical on a level that we haven't really seen since the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution. They famously destroyed churches, they fired priests, they tore down religious icons. It was very anti-clerical. That alienated a lot of the very devout Spanish peasantry and this more powerful Spanish military conservatives. And that sort of led to a revolt in 1936 after a conservative was assassinated by a radical anarchist group. A lot of the various kind of conservative causes were brought together under a single umbrella called the Falange Española, Spanish fascism, if you will, under a guy named Francisco Franco, who was a general in North Africa. And his group is kind of known in English history as the Nationalists, and who opposed him were the members of the Spanish Republic. They were backed up by various anarchist groups, trade unions groups, anti-fascists, communists, as well as a large legion of foreign volunteers from pretty much all over the world who went to Spain to help fight against the Nationalists. And collectively, they are known as the Republicans. Now, the war is going to go for 3 years. The Nationalists are eventually going to win, and then Franco is going to rule Spain until 1975, when it goes back to being a constitutional monarchy, which it is to this day. And of course, the war is very, very touchy to this day in Spain. So in many ways, it's a trial run for World War II. It's an ideological rivalry. So for example, the Spanish Republic is supported by the Soviet Union, where the Nationalists are supported by Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. There's all these brand new weapons that hadn't been seen in World War I, bigger and better tanks that move faster, dive bombers that get really close to the ground and drop bombs really precisely, as well as these handheld machine guns that make hand-to-hand combat really deadly and intensify violence. There's also the targeting of civilians in a way that had not been seen in World War I. And probably the most famous instance of this would be the bombing of Guernica, the city in the Basque country, in which the German Condor Legion, you can see a picture of them here on the right, bombed the city and killed quite a few civilians. We're going to see a lot of that during World War II. In addition to that, there were a lot of massacres of prisoners on both sides. To this day, they still find mass graves in Spain all the time. And that's why the Civil War is still a very, very touchy subject there. All that said, we're about to head into World War II. You may notice that 1939 date right there. So thanks so much for joining me. You should definitely be able to answer those three questions from the beginning of the presentation. My name is Mr. Little, and I'll see you next time.